This diagram represents the change management process relationship map, essentially a high-level view of the program and also graphically depicting the relationships between the processes used within this program as the program seeks to deliver its products and or services. Let's begin by looking at the relationships. Change management does certainly relate to other processes. For instance, the asset and configuration management process is something that change management relies upon in order to ensure the timely update of inventory as well as configuration item information. It's through the development and the completion of the configuration management database and the coordination of use by the change process owner that the necessary information that's going to be used to feed the configuration items are identified and supplied. In relation to problem management, a key process that is a source for a request for change is in fact a problem, and changes are required to implement workarounds in order to fix known errors. Change management also interfaces with the incident management process. When a change produces a delayed incident ticket, a mandatory requirement for an emergency change is that it must be related to a high severity incident. And so incidents feed the change management process. Also, there's a relationship with the notification process. Of course, the notification process is going to represent procedures that describe the management of operations for communication throughout all areas of managing notifications, and there certainly are going to be notifications as a part of change management. Now, having looked at that, let's take a high-level overview look at the various steps in the change management process. We see that the change management process begins with an RFC, or a request for change, based on an incident or a problem. That RFC is recorded and then reviewed. Once reviewed, we will assess and evaluate the change. Part of the assessment and evaluation will be essentially prioritizing and categorizing those changes. Then we will need to authorize the change. The authorization of the change will be based on the type of change, the actual procedure towards authorization. So the category for changes might be a standard change, a normal change, or an emergency change. And so formal authorization is going to be obtained for each change from a change authority, but the levels of authorization for a particular type are going to be judged by the actual change itself, its type, its size, its risk. Once authorized, the change will need to be planned, and so we'll have the scheduling of a change that occurs as a part of the plan update process. Once this occurs, the next step would be coordinating the implementation of that change, followed by the review and the close of the change record. Now, each of these processes has individual steps that we will proceed through in order to ensure that that part of the overall process happens successfully. But in this section, we've just taken a high-level overview of the change management process as well as its relationship to other processes. This graphic describes the change initiation process as well as the normal change request process. We should begin by defining a normal change. This is a change that will be authorized by a change advisory board. It is a change that introduces medium to high risk to the organization and or has medium to high impact to the business. Normal changes fall between standard changes, which use a procedure and are pre-authorized, and emergency changes, both of which we will be taking a further more detailed look at. Well, let's look at the steps that make up the change initiation and the normal change request process. The process begins at step 1 with a change initiator. It's the change initiator who's responsible for creating the change request, or CR, and documenting a short description of the change and recording the business justification. What is the purpose for the change? What advantage is it going to provide for the business? In that documentation, we also need to describe the risks that are associated with this change to the business. The risk of a failure to update a piece of software successfully, the risk of losing the availability of a particular technology. And then we would need to change the record status to new/open for the change request. From there, we'll move to step 2, which is the change implementer. The change implementer is going to review that change record to ensure that it's complete and all of the necessary information is included. We'll also determine if review and input is required from other functions. And if the answer to those questions are yes, then we'll need to meet with the team. At that point, you'd update the status to active and assessing. Now, if any of those are incomplete, we just move the responsibility back to step 1 to the change initiator, and that individual would need to fill in that missing information. Step 3 then is a peer review. If it is required, if that is required, then the change implementer will meet with the team to review and assess the change. If it's not, we would move directly to step 5. Step 5 is to assess and assign risk and priority. And this is the responsibility of the change implementer. That individual will be reviewing and assessing the change request in order to determine its impact on other IT services. Also, to determine if an outage is required, as well as assessing the necessary resources, what will be required in order to initiate this change, both in terms of personnel as well as in terms of schedule and technology. The change implementer would at this point record a test plan, including the builder tester, the individual who will be performing the test. Also, we need to record an implementation and communication plan. What are the steps that we will use to implement this change in a production environment and who needs to be notified? And then assigning a risk and priority, along with identifying the configuration item and the documentation. There we see a relationship with your asset configuration management processes. Once those things have been done, we would move on to step 6. Step 6 is the official planning of the change. You would need to, the change implementer needs to complete the change request form online and submit it by Wednesday at 3 p.m. Then we need to review the change catalog. This would be for standard change request, as well as reviewing the change calendar, the window of time that is available for these changes, and then officially plan out the change. When will be the planned start and end date, for instance. At that point, we can update the change status to submitted and then send an automated notification to the change advisory board. At this point, we will have a variance as to which direction we go based on the type of change. So if it is a normal change, we'll move on. That's the process we're going to follow now. At this point, though, if it is a standard change or an emergency change, then there will be different steps that are taken. For normal changes, the Change Advisory Board will meet weekly on a Thursday. They will receive and examine the change request. They'll be looking at it for completeness as well as practicality, and then updating the change record as being, as CAB review, Change Advisory Board review. They are in that process. That moves right to step number 9, where they assess if the appropriate risk category was selected based on a risk assessment. They'll also conduct a review of the impact and resource assessment questions, and then either authorize or reject the change request based on their findings. So at that point, if the change is approved, we would move right to step number 12. If it is not approved, we would move to step 11. Let's deal with the not approved. If it's not approved, the change manager will document any comments from the change advisory board, and that will include the reason for the rejection of the change. The change status will be updated to rejected, and then the change moves back essentially to step 1 of the process. Assuming that the change is authorized, the change advisory board and change manager will record the comments, the change manager will record the comments from the change advisory board. The change manager will then inform the implementer that the request was accepted. The status of the change will be updated to scheduling plan, and then we will record the implementation deployment date and to determine if the change can be a standard change. Which technically moves us over here to 13. Is this a candidate? Is this type of change that has gone through the normal change process actually a candidate for a standard change? Remember, a standard change does not go through a CAB. Instead, it includes pre-authorized changes that are implemented just based on procedures. And so if it is a standard candidate, then the change advisory board will create that standard change in the change catalog. They'll update it in the change record, and they'll send a notification to the implementer. If the change is not a candidate for standard changes, then the responsibility shifts back to the change implementer, who will update the status to a work in progress, also update any dependencies for the process if needed, document all testing of the change that has occurred or will occur, document the backout plan details, a recovery process. What happens if the change is not successful? How will we roll back? That's always a critical part to the planning process. We need to ensure change communication and notification. And then finally, update the implementation date if that is necessary. Now, the communication here is with the change manager, communicating who needs to be notified as a part of the change process, as well as communicating any of those outage possibilities. Step 17 is the change implementer actually deploying the change. Once we've deployed the change, we want to ensure that the change is successful. Part of that is, or the potential result of that would be determining if backout is required. So if there has been a negative impact from the change, then we would back out. And then you want to document any issues. And from that point, it would flow to steps 4.1, which is going to be our review and close procedure. So those are the steps that we have as a part of the change initiation and normal change request process. Let's take a brief overview look at the individual steps that are required for a standard change request. If you recall, a standard change is a change to a service or the infrastructure for which the approach has been pre-authorized by the change advisory board. And so a standard change is one that is accepted and for which we actually have an established procedure in order to provide that particular change requirement. And so usually in these cases, the risk is low and well understood. The tasks are well known. They've been proven, they're documented, and authority is effectively given in advance in order to make these changes. And they would generally be minimal types of changes. So if in step 7A it has been determined that the request is a standard change request, then we're moving on to step 15, where the change implementer is going to go through the process of creating a change record, recording the deployment date, and then assigning the change record a status of new in the change record. This graphic describes the process for implementing emergency changes in the environment. Emergency changes are critical incidents, changes that need to go through the IT critical incident response process. This is for changes that are intended to repair an error in a service that's negatively impacting the business, and not just negatively impacting the business, but doing so to a very high degree. So the emergency change procedure will follow the normal procedure with a couple of exceptions. And that is that approval will be given by a special emergency change advisory board, and testing may be reduced if that's considered to be a necessary risk in order to expedite the change. Documentation may also be deferred, typically until normal working hours. So there are going to be separate processes for the emergency change, just as there were for the standard change. But as we can see from this graphic, it is going to be more involved. So let's take a look at the individual steps. If a change is deemed an emergency change, the first step is in relation to the incident management system. This would be the responsibility of the critical incident owner, who would need to create the incident in ServiceNow, assign the appropriate response owner. That incident record is going to include the configuration item that is impacted, as well as impact details. And it will be the assigned incident priority that will determine the appropriate response and recovery time. We move right from there to the steps with the change implementer. The change implementer would need to notify, discuss, assess impact and risk, and determine actions with an emergency change advisory board. Also to determine the security implications with the security manager, review the change calendar and window, just to make sure that scheduled changes can happen, to look for any conflicts, and then override those conflicts due to the fact that this is an emergency change. You will follow the notification process steps for an unplanned outage. The Emergency Change Advisory Board is a separate board for emergency changes. They will need to assess the impact and risk of the emergency, as well as reviewing the potential impact on business and other critical technical services, and finally authorize or reject the emergency change request. So the next step is determining if the ECR is approved. If not, then the change manager will document the advisory board's comments and the reason for rejection. It'll update the status to rejected, and we're back to square one. Assuming that the emergency change is reviewed or is approved, then the next step will be to determine if we need to override scheduled changes. If we do need to override scheduled changes, then the IT manager will be responsible for contacting the change implementer of said scheduled changes to not proceed with the scheduled change. The emergency change will trump the scheduled change. However, if there isn't any need to override any scheduled changes, then the change implementer will be responsible for preparing a backup plan, conducting possible testing, and then documenting other issues and problems that are recognized but not conducive for this type of change. That's part of the incident management process. The implementer will also need to determine the deployment time and initiate communication and notification processes. That notification process will be the responsibility of the change manager, as well as communicating any emergency outages. Once this is done, the change implementer will deploy the change, determine whether the change deployment was successful and if a backout is required, and then document any information and issues during the deployment. The final documentation of the emergency change, all issues, and the result will be the responsibility of the change implementer. And once that's finished, we'll move to 4.1, which is the review and closure process. So this process is a bit more involved than the standard change and is a process for those high risk, high impact changes that will sometimes be necessary to implement in the environment. This graphic describes the final steps in the change management process, those of the review and closure. Let's take a look at the detailed steps that make up this process. First, we see that all types of change will ultimately end with the review and closure process, except for those changes that have been rejected. If the change is rejected by the Change Advisory Board, then if you'll recall, it goes back to square one. So if we've found ourselves at the review and closure process, then that means that the change was not only approved, but it was implemented successfully. So at this point, the change implementer is responsible for reviewing, validating, and documenting the change results and objectives, and also validating that the change request is accurate and it was complete. If it was an emergency change, then the Change Advisory Board will review, validate, and discuss a number of different elements. Did the emergency change meet the desired effect? Were there no unexpected or undesirable side effects to the emergency change? The resources that were made available, were they suitable? Was the implementation plan, did it work correctly? Was the change implemented quickly? Was the backup plan, did it function correctly if it was necessary to use it? And then what are some follow-up actions that might need to be done? This is the responsibility of the Change Advisory Board to ensure that all of these things evaluate to true. If that's the case, they also would evaluate if it was accurate and complete. They need to determine if there's an additional evaluation report that is needed, and also whether to initiate problem management. Following all those evaluations, we would update the change record status to closed and update the incident state to resolved. At that point, we would have a relationship with the asset configuration management processes. If it was not an emergency change, was it a rescheduled change? If it was a rescheduled change, then the change implementer needs to update in the change record status as new, and then maintain prior change information and documentation as a part of that record, but that moves us back to step one. So if it was rescheduled because of timing or because it was overridden by an emergency change, then it would follow a different process, essentially looping back to the beginning. However, if it was not a rescheduled change, then it was a normal change. Was it successful? Yes or no? If no, the change implementer needs to document that the change had a negative impact, didn't meet the expected results, and that backout occurred. Or, if that wasn't the case, possibly it was successful, but there were issues during the deployment. And so the status in the change record will be unsuccessful or successful with issues. It was either completely unsuccessful and you had to back out, or it was successful, but it caused issues. At that point, the change implementer needs to conduct a post-implementation review and update the status to awaiting review. The Change Advisory Board would then conduct that review at the next CAB meeting and evaluate if the review is accurate and complete and determine the need for an evaluation report, or possibly to initiate problem management. The record status would be closed, and then the change initiator would be notified. If the change was successful, the change implementer will update the change record to completed successful, update the status to awaiting review, and update the configuration management database. That includes asset configuration management process and system documentation, as well as business service maps that would need to be updated. And the incident state would be updated to resolved. Notice it still needs to go through that final evaluation and review by the change advisory board before it is officially ended as a part of the process. So that is a look at the individual procedure steps involved in the review and closure process as a part of the overall change management process.